All right, we're live. This is Joseph McGill. Welcome again to the second day of the conference, Changing Narratives and Changing Times. It's not often that I get to be a part of the sessions in the manner that I am with this one, but in the vetting of the applications or the proposals to present, Thomas Sutton was one of those applicants, and he did some investigation into one of the places that I've stayed in the past, right here in the state of South Carolina. So we're going to talk about the site in Anderson, South Carolina, and what I brought into it and what I brought to this subject matter thus far. And Thomas is going to have a follow-up with the information that his research has come across. So I'm going to go ahead. This is a 17-minute video that I want to get started so that you can see my angle of where I came from with this. So I'm going to go ahead and get this video started. Let's see, let's go over here. And all right. And so Thomas, if you want to say a little bit about yourself while I'm getting this video going, you can go ahead and get that out of the way right now while I'm getting going here with the video.
Sure thing. My name is Thomas Sutton. I'm currently a second-year graduate student at the Clemson College of Charleston Joint Program in Historic Preservation. And going up last semester, my class all got together and we got on a trip out to Anderson, South Carolina to investigate these buildings that Joe had looked at previously as part of a class project. And we did a fairly thorough documentation of them and research of them. And we came to slightly different conclusions than what Joe came to in his initial research. And so that's what we're here to talk about.
All right. Well, thank you. Into those states for South Carolina is coming from Charleston, South Carolina. And here it is. So I want to pause right here, guys. Let this do its thing.
Most of the cabins were made of double cabins or double buildings where you had a single chimney that would take the heat from both sides, and it would go up from a chimney on one side of the duplex, so to speak, and another on the other side, and then just above that by roughly 10 feet up, then it would join and the heat then was going out of a single chimney at the very top. Typically, the ideal cabin for heating purposes was 16 by 16, and yet we're talking about that being for 4, 5, 6, 7 or more people. So that begins to give you a little bit more idea of what their the whole tone of their life was like, because they were not where they could just have lots of open space and be away from everybody else.
The primary markers are, besides the fact that they were built mid-19th century or before 1860, is the one room, no kitchen. Obviously, people lived here with other support systems in place.
One of the differences that applied to the slaves before emancipation was that they tended on the whole to be tied to a single plantation and stay there the bulk of their life.
Usually in rural South Carolina, you look for the plantation house and then hope the slave cabins are behind it or somewhere around. This inside an urban environment like Anderson is a new landscape for us to explore.
There are other structures like this that have evolved, and we want to know about those, and we want to tell the story of those places. Again, getting back to the built environment of African Americans, what better place to start than slave cabins?
The wonderful thing about these places, though, is the fact that they communicate their history in ways that you don't know it right off. The history unfolds as you live with them and as other documentation pops up. And there's still a lot of mystery with these buildings. Those buildings are like repositories of knowledge that if you just pause and sit there for a while, you can start listening to it. And you start being inspired by it. And that's why it's so important.
It's important to know what was and what was wrong about it and how people fared living into a slave cabin. We want to look at the great mansions and know what they were about. Why shouldn't we want to know about what everyday life was like for much more common people?
There are a lot of plantation houses that we can visit, but a lot of those plantation houses that we visit tend to concentrate on just that, those plantation houses, and not a whole lot on the slave cabins.
In conversations with folks from the African American community, there tends to be a painful memories that many people believe they would rather not deal with. The most recent, of course, is the system of segregation we had in the state. And some of these buildings reminds them of that painful aspect and becomes a symbol of that.
During the time of segregation, there were buildings out there that, although they were nice, big, and iconic, they've got a history too. Were they always welcoming to African Americans? Or were we relegated to some obscure place within that building? And we got to think about those buildings that were built specifically to accommodate us. Those hotels, when we traveled, we had to plan our trips accordingly. We had to go to those places that would be welcoming to African Americans. So I think by starting here with slave cabins and getting more people interested in the story of slave cabins, then we can branch out from there and tell the story of all those other buildings out there that can help us tell the story of African Americans.
I personally believe that our history, the good, the bad, it's all part of the history and it's all organically connected. You wouldn't have had the good without the bad. It was all part of it, and it must be remembered. as fun as old buildings are, and old buildings are to look at, it's about the people that touched them. It's about finding out our history through the people who lived there, who helped build our community, who made the sacrifices, who lived the life during the times that our communities were being developed. Because in that time when our communities were being built is that time and space where things worked properly, where the community grew, where commerce happened, and where the foundation of our towns and cities were developed.
There's been enormous amount of stigmatizing for those who had slaves compared to those who didn't, and that creates a whole different dynamic of how the general perception was, and whether the people who didn't have slaves were nicer people because they didn't have slaves, or it may have been just because they were poorer, or all sorts of other types of things.
The experience that I've looked into and studied, the experience of the slaves that lived on plantations were as diverse as the plantation owners.
There was a very prosperous owner in the Low Country who did have about 400 slaves. He had gone out riding in his carriage one day with some people with him, and he saw this pretty flower across from where he was and asked what in the world that was, because it was so striking to him. It turned out to be his main crop, and he didn't even know what it was. By contrast, particularly in the upstate, owners were almost always themselves involved in the agricultural process. It was a much more intimate type of thing and a much more familiar type of thing.
Well, I think probably the perception of snapshots of history as we see it are somewhat misleading. They're factual, but it's somewhat misleading. You know, there are a lot of things throughout the course of slavery and during that period of time that so many people don't know, especially young people.
One of them is this example in my book of Patsy, who was a slave, and the owner so regarded her that he had a charcoal drawing made of her, and it was passed down through multiple generations. And there were other similar things with Lucinda, who was a slave, and we don't know the whole story about her, and there's apparently a very good backstory that we don't know, but her owner paid for the premier marble makers in Charleston to make a tombstone for her and ship it to Pendleton. It would obviously have to have been something fairly dramatic for it to have been so much that they would buy this tombstone.
Some were taken care of very well, and some weren't.
The very concept about trying to describe slavery in some ways hardly works, because there are so many different variations about every different type of thing, from one plantation to the next. One of the things that is fairly obvious, at least just in a personal context, but we don't get the specifics, is that somebody living on plantation A may have been very nice and decent within the circumstances with their slaves, and have been equally well aware that the slave owner next door would be beating the slave. And so you could get something just within a mile variation on something like that.
There are things that we are proud of and that we're not proud of in regards to our history. But if we don't...
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Corey, our technician. Thank you, Corey.
Every time I talk, I come back on. Sorry.
All right. So thank you. I ended the video. Well, I asked Corey to end the video early because of the rough start that we got. I still want to give Thomas ample time for to introduce himself properly if he wants to do that again for those who may have joined us later in the game. So Thomas, I'm going to go ahead and yield to you so that you can present.
All right, thank you so much. So like I said earlier, my name is Thomas Sutton, and I'm currently a second-year graduate student at the Clemson and College of Charleston Joint Masters of Science in Historic Preservation. And last semester for us, we had the opportunity to be invited out to go and investigate and document those same buildings in Anderson, South Carolina. And so we went through, we did our process, and we put together a report, which I then have put together a little summary here to present to you guys, where I show our findings and our ideas about the building's history and their significance. And so let me launch right into it. So in the spring of 2021, the Clemson University College of Charleston graduate program in historic preservation began a project to document and investigate the structures located at 312 to 318 Morris Street in Anderson, South Carolina. Prior to this, the buildings were believed to be former potential slave dwellings, and the program students found themselves excited to be able to study firsthand examples of such an important and complex portion of American history. After it began, the investigation into the Morris Street dwellings turned up some rather surprising results, which led to a reshaping of the project and of the narrative for the buildings themselves. This surprise and subsequent shift, while at first perhaps disappointing, led to a unique and excellent opportunity to study and explore often underappreciated and forgotten historical topics and concepts. This experience forced those involved to develop a new mindset in their project approach, causing a potential new narrative for the properties to be formed. There exist 4 buildings on the Morris Street property, commonly known as the Morris Street dwellings or cottages. The original estimated date of construction for 3 of the buildings was early to mid-19th century, with the 4th likely being constructed later, closer to late 19th, early 20th century. The original estimated date replaced the older 3 structures in a prime time period to be considered as potential former slave dwellings from just prior to the Civil War. Those involved in this investigative project, however, found some inconsistencies and missing pieces over the course of the investigation in regards to property research, historic mapping, and building technology. The evidence discovered did not line up with expectations, and the date of construction was called into question. The inconsistencies eventually led to the construction of a new historical narrative and potential interpretation of property that shifted a fair bit from the original. As stated previously, the date of construction of the Morris Street buildings was initially believed to be somewhere during the early to mid-19th century. However, there exists nothing concrete within the archival record to prove or disprove this assumption. The earliest records located during the research for this project were property records and deeds dating back to the year 1892. These records show the sale of the property, which consisted of all 4 structures, by J.P. Sullivan to C.L. White. White then owned the properties until 1938, using them as rental properties, and they have continued to pass through various hands over the years, slowly falling into greater degrees of misuse and disrepair. Then in 2016, the properties were purchased by their current owner, who has begun the mission to ensure their continued protection and appreciation for future generations. Due to the lack of documentation in regards to the initial date of construction, the process of proving an accurate date to the buildings falls to studying the buildings themselves and their remaining physical fabric for any possible clues or evidence. The physical investigation of the 4 structures began with detailed documentation, followed by construction of a conditions assessment for each building. The process involves a thorough investigation of all architectural elements of the building from foundation to roof. Each design and structural element was studied and their state and conditions were recorded. For the first step, each building was thoroughly photographed inside and out, detailed measurements were taken, and architectural drawings were produced to ensure a complete record of the buildings as they were at the time. Then began the initial inspection of the property, which showed the Morris Street cottages to be in a fairly significant state of disrepair. The buildings had been left on their own for a fairly long period of time, with large amounts of damage and deterioration having occurred, with the buildings becoming partially overgrown and facing problems such as exterior damage and other issues. The state of the buildings could potentially account for some of the inconsistencies, as damage can make proper identification of some materials difficult. However, the state of the buildings is not so severe as to account for the majority of the evidence. The investigation continued, covering each of the buildings individually, and it was during this first-hand look at the buildings that the evidence that led to the project's new developing theories would begin to appear. The first evidence was easily dismissed as simply abnormal building choices or easily explained away. However, it steadily began to mount up through the physical inspection. Following the on-site investigation was detailed research of all records related to buildings, deeds, maps, articles, and other records. This property research, however, turned up little to no data that could go against those early theories. It was soon clear that there appeared to be no definitive evidence to support the expected date of construction, and the evidence that did seem to exist suggested that these buildings were younger than previously anticipated. The architectural investigation of the buildings was the primary event to cause major uncertainty within the project. Each of the 4 buildings are simple in design. They are single-story, 1- or 2-room wood frame structures. The exteriors are varied in their design elements, with some incorporating faux brick or other elements, but most common is wooden lap siding. Additionally, each building possesses a sheet metal roof, which appears to have possibly been replaced at some point in their history. Each of the buildings sits upon a brick-pier foundation, and it's these bricks which provide the first piece of possible evidence. The bricks within the foundations appear to be machine-cut bricks molded and cut to identical shapes and sizes and easily identifiable at a glance. This type of masonry did not see mainstream usage in construction until around 1870. There does exist the possibility that the buildings were raised above ground level at some point after their construction to be placed on top of these piers. A common method of protection, particularly in the south where flooding is common. However, none of the telltale signs of this process can be seen. Therefore, it remains likely that this foundation is the original construction for the structures. Above the foundation line, the framing and siding of the building contains some of the more upfront evidence regarding the potential dates of construction. The wood within the building walls have circular saw markings visible in numerous locations. Circular saws did not achieve widespread usage in building construction until the latter half of the 19th century, again indicating a slightly later date of construction. Another clue within the building is the frequent usage of wire nails. These are the same type of nail utilized in most modern construction. Wire nails are another construction element that did not exist until the end of the 19th century, gaining increased popularity and phasing out other options. There do exist some cut nails scattered sporadically throughout the construction, with these being the prominent choice prior to the popularity of wire nails. Cut nails have appeared in structures since the beginning of the 19th century. However, due to their sporadic usage in these particular buildings, it is likely that the builders simply had some cut nails left over from prior to the adoption of wire nails. While other inconsistencies could be caused by repair or additions to the structures, the likelihood of the building's framing being entirely replaced is minimal at best. Due to this evidence, both archival and architectural, it was decided that producing an exact, accurate date of construction was at this time impossible. The best current estimation, however, places the date likely between 1870 and 1890, with further research needed to officially corroborate. Because it became impossible for the investigation to definitively say what these buildings were originally used for, we decided that the most ethical decision was to instead focus on what we were sure of, that these structures have been used as homes in earlier construction, and stood as lasting landmarks to a period that has often been underappreciated in the historical narrative. This decision launched the project down a new and entirely unexpected path, leading those involved to focus less on the buildings and more on the places and people that surround them. While the topic was not what was expected, the shift turned out to be an opportunity in disguise, as the program launched into an investigation on the cabins as an example of life during and after Reconstruction, and began a deep dive into the surrounding neighborhood and the city of Anderson's role in this period of dramatic change and development. For this new project direction, focus was placed upon the buildings recording inhabitants, the neighborhood around them, and the town of Anderson as a whole. The shift provided all involved with a look into new concepts and fields. Each of these possessed their own new challenges, but also contained their own unique and interesting elements. The years following the Civil War and through till the turn of the century was a time of great change and unrest among the American populace. Places such as Anderson, South Carolina, were the front lines of this cultural shift, needing to go through many adjustments and a lot of growth into the community it is now. The Moore Street cottages, while potentially not used as slave dwellings, still remain a significant place. While a shift in identity might seem like a cause for alarm, this is not true for these buildings. There exists a multitude of reasons that these buildings matter. First and foremost being their standing as excellent example of early Reconstruction era homes. The buildings themselves appear to have received little in the ways of major alteration since their construction, and thus provide a look into the lifestyle of the working class during this tumultuous period of time. Their simple design and close quarters can remind us of days gone by, and by the struggles that can often be overlooked in the narrative. Just for this alone, these buildings are significant, yet there are many other reasons for their importance, ranging from the city they're in to people who live in them. To start off on the large-scale side of things, the cottages find themselves in a great location filled with history and meaning. Anderson, South Carolina was first founded in 1826 as primarily an agriculturally centered community. Prior to the Civil War, Anderson held one of the largest number of enslaved persons in South Carolina. In 1860, there were over 8,000 slaves in Anderson. Many of these people remained within Anderson following the war, instead of roots in the hopes of making the city their home. Since its inception, agriculture was the mainstay in Anderson, being one of the state's leading producers of wheat, cotton, and other products, and this stayed true following the Civil War. but the city also developed and diversified its options. Going into the back half of the 19th century, the city's downtown commercial district developed and thrived, and various industrial locations and workshops started to appear, which provided places of work for the residents of the Moore Street cottages and their neighbors. Moving into the end of the century, Anderson earned its current nickname as the Electric City for being among the first to directly transport electricity through the city using long-distance cable. The community did suffer later on due to the decline of the cotton industry, but was able to bounce back and continues to thrive today, and is now home to multiple national historic districts. The Moore Street cottages sit within walking distance of downtown Anderson and are surrounded by numerous historic buildings and landmarks. The downtown Anderson Historic District was first nominated and established in 1971, with Moore Street falling within its boundaries. It is home to several well-documented and researched locations back to the founding of the city of Anderson, such as the Caldwell Morris Johnson home, due to Dr. William Bullion Johnson, a minister and outspoken voice for the education of women. Just around the corner from the Moore Street buildings stand multiple long-lasting religious institutions, such as Bethel AME, which appears in the same location in the 1918 Sangor map of the neighborhood, and Grace Episcopal, which first opened its doors in 1851, with the Moore Street cottages having been around for most of this history. There also exists many other residential structures in the neighborhood which share design similarities with the Moore Street cottages. However, few of them have seen as few alterations and updates as the cottages, showing their importance as a representation of the neighborhood's residential life and history. There have been many occupants of the Moore Street dwellings over the years, many of which only occupied the buildings for a short period of time. Many of the inhabitants worked at the nearby mills and workshops, such as inhabitant Joss Edwards. Other inhabitants included a driver by the name of Ramon Brown, and shoe shiner and John Cruzen, among many others whose lives still remain shrouded and in need of exploration. The Moore Street cottages continued to be inhabited up until the late century, hosting dozens of residents over the course of their history, and while many stayed only briefly, some made a home there for a significant portion of their lives. Due to the time span and limitations of this project, many of the inhabitants, especially those earliest ones at Moore Street, remain unexplored, and further research is needed and hoped for. Yet from what we can be uncovered, the Moore Street cottages, with their rich and diverse history of inhabitants, stand as a window into the lives of many and their stories. The Moore Street cottages did not turn out to be exactly what was expected of them, but things rarely do. And from this experience, a lesson can be learned. Even though research may not go in the expected direction, this is far from a cause for alarm. And because of this revolution on Moore Street, those who were involved in researching it had the incredible opportunity to study not just the buildings, but the neighborhood, community, and residents of a historically rich and valuable area. Those involved had their eyes open to new areas of history that they had yet to explore, and the results were far better than could be expected. So when the narrative changes, instead of fighting it, perhaps it might be better to stick around and see where it goes. A shifting narrative like this one can lead to new ideas and opportunities for the project, and those involved with the possibility of being the best thing that could happen. And that is what I've written up. If Joe wants to come on back. Thank you all
right.
for that.
All right. Hey, see, that's why it's important that we work together on trying to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. Of course, my goal is to bring attention to those who were enslaved, who inhabited buildings that still exist. And I don't think we completely missed the mark, because the time period that you speculate is 1870 through 1890. 1870, I'm sure the builders of those places, or at least the people who lived in them initially, were formerly enslaved. So
Most likely, yes.
we're still in the ballpark. So it's a beautiful thing. And another thing I want to bring to light is, we older folks may think we know all the answers, and that what we speculate is right. But it's always good to do the research. It's always good to be thorough. In this thing that I do, finding these slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States, I don't profess to be the expert on it. I gather this information, and what Thomas here has done is added to the research, and I want to encourage you to continue to go in that direction. And hey, if that means going and investigating all the 150 plus sites I've stayed in the past, then so be it. Let it be that. I think That should always be the case. The investigation should always be there because up until this point uh, we were dealing with the opposite, the lack of a desire, the lack of will to want to even, um, you know, investigate such meager buildings. But with these meager buildings comes the lives of the people who live in them, the people uh, who established them, the people who built them, the people who made it possible for the folks who ordered them to do that or store their labor to be it done. Their stories are being told through these places, and I really appreciate Thomas what you have brought here. I'm seeing one comment here from D. Mallon. She says, "Fascinating turn of research. How did you find out the identities of the occupants?" Is her question to you, Thomas.
Uh, the ones we were able to find, we identified through deed research and census data as far back as we could find to look for anyone listed under those properties, and then digging around through ancestry.com and any other possible records, news sources that we could find from Anderson that might contain their names and their identities.
Well, that's beautiful because we could take that information and go further back in their existence. Find out who some of their ancestors were, because their ancestors were some of those who may have been enslaved in the Anderson, South Carolina area. They may be descendants of those who were enslaved there. Now, I don't know if that was a place that could be being rented for whoever could afford to pay the rent, or was it just relegated to black folks. There are those things to study also in the equation, because that's kind of a form of redlining. Another thing that we touch on, with the slave dwelling project, and talking about those things that replace slavery and the opportunity for formerly enslaved to pursue happiness. And I also heard in your research that this may have been made part of the milling operation in Anderson. I know textile, cotton was big. Was that a part of the milling that you referred to, or was it maybe another type?
I don't know if the buildings themselves are connected to the milling, but it does appear that several of the inhabitants would have had their jobs at those nearby mills and textile plants.
Yeah,
that's what I mentioned in the paper.
Well, see, that's great. See, that's connecting these dots. Making these buildings relevant because we're putting people in them. We're talking about the people. But in order for us to talk about the people, the buildings must exist. The buildings have to be there. But also that desire for those buildings to be there must exist too, because we treat these buildings kind of like we treat our history. We want the buildings to exist that can tell a good story, a story with a happy ending. And usually those big architecturally significant buildings do that. The buildings that Thomas, you and I are talking about right now, they don't kind of reach that status of being architecturally significant. So the work that we do, the attention that I bring, the research that you bring to this, I think is great.
Yeah, they might not be as pretty as the other buildings, but they usually have a much more interesting story behind them. And I think that's the cool part.
Yes. Okay. Well, despite the rough start, which I hope the technicians can get rid of it on the front end before they send it live, I think this was great. I really enjoyed presenting with you. I think there's more potential for presentations of this matter in the future. So stay open to that, please. So those are my closing remarks. I'm going to turn it over to you.
I just thank everybody who came out and listened and enjoyed the presentation. I just want to take a quick moment to thank the current owners of the properties for allowing us to come out and spend time there and research them and being open to hearing what we thought. And I want to give a huge thank you to every single one of my classmates at the Clemson College Charleston program, all of whom contributed to the initial research and did a lot of work on this project. Some of them more than me. I just summarized it and presented it. So thank you to all of you. if you guys see this. And yeah, that's all I have.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thanks for tuning in.